Hello listeners and welcome back to another boisterous bout of Barter in the Booth. This episode recounts a tempestuous and Tolkien-esque mission that some friends and I embarked on to conquer the illustrious Mount Fuji. It's from the summer of 2021 and it's titled Mr. Fuji. Having such little prior knowledge of the land I now call home, I came without a bucket list. I knew I wanted to explore as vastly as possible, dive bollock first into the culture, and entangle myself in some podcast-worthy escapades. But the fruitfulness of my time here was never going to be gauged by ticked or unticked boxes. Idea of what experiences I would be ashamed to have missed, come the eventual day that I hand back my residency and bid Japan farewell. It was a relatively short list, and as my action-packed second year drew to a close, I was satisfied that if I left there and then, I'd have no regrets. But, as it happened, I had decided to stay for a third, and my thirst for Japan's rich culture and stunning landscape was far from quenched. There was one challenge in particular that had lurked around the fringes of my must-dos. It was not keeping me up at night, but I knew that as my time grew short, it would become an increasingly niggly thorn in my side. So, when a friend told me he was putting a posse together to scale Mount Fuji, I was all in. We flew into Tokyo the day before the 2021 Olympic opening ceremony. What fools, you must be thinking. Alas, the shadow of Corona still lingered over Japan and had rendered the games a farcical closed-door affair. The place was a ghost town. It was eerie to see every TV channel, newspaper stand and website on earth overrun with stories from this great meeting of athletic metal, but to feel nothing in the city in which it was happening. We trudged through the streets, fully loaded with sacks and cases, the only ones resembling anything like tourists. We would not start our treacherous ascent of Fuji until the following day, and were blessed with a sunny afternoon to wander Tokyo. It occurred to me that this is something I had not done since I first visited Japan from Hong Kong in 2017. I must have been to Tokyo 10 times since then, but each visit I was either passing through or on a quick slash and dash type mission with no time for exploration. Staggeringly exciting as they are, my juvenile lust for the metropoles has simmered down somewhat, and for me, the majority of Japan's charm lies beyond the bright lights, concrete, and weebo wank fodder. That being said, there's still those rare pockets of the city that provide peaceful respite from the hustle and bustle of the main streets. One such place is Meiji Jingu, a Shinto shrine buried in a 170-acre forest. Just a stone's throw away from Harajuku station, it provides a still, cool haven of traditionalism from the overpowering, trendy district of the capital. I'm not above youth culture by any means, and am deflated to see teenagers not showing two fingers to the system, but you can only dodge goths in the sticky summer heat for so long before you start to aggressively fantasize about joining the Amish. I don't get much of a cultural hard-on for shrines as some others, but I certainly get a hard-on for wandering through ageless, silent forests where I can daydream about scoring a bicycle kick in the last minutes of the Champions League final. The evening was spent at our rented house with Korean fried chicken and frosty cans. Now, as something of a spice connoisseur, I was mortified to discover upon moving to Japan that their cuisine is about as spicy as a nun's browsing history. Having to deal every day with this pussyfootery has completely debased my understanding of the Scoville scale, so I thought nothing of ordering the luminous red 3-chili red-hot dragon's breath sauce. Usually such a bold advertisement would transpire to a couple of peppercorns or maybe a pouch of wasabi on the side. Evidently, I had understated the gastronomical chasm that exists across the Sea of Japan, as one bite of this stuff had me frantically cooling my tongue with my own tears. It was delicious, but was about as welcome in my gut as a handful of screws, and I had enough to feed the whole of BTS for a week. I'm sure the thousands of others prepping for a 2-day climb of the highest mountain in the country were sitting down to a plate of fresh, carb-rich nutrition, perfect for slowly fueling the body for the task at hand. I, meanwhile, was washing down chicken that could strip paint off a car with cheap bubbling lager. Shackleton would be rolling in his grave. While we abused our senses of taste, smell and touch with the aforementioned meal, it seemed a shame to neglect our eyes and ears, so we flicked on the absolute fucking carnival that is Japanese television. Thankfully, a large chunk of broadcasting space was occupied by the Olympics, but even the Japanese coverage of something as straightforward as long jump was violently cut with awkward, drawn-out close-ups of cockroaches, glum-faced officials, and crying women's spandex-clad arses. But this was nothing. Changing over to the regular programming, we took that all too familiar tumble down the Lewis Carroll-esque rabbit hole. I think most people who have lived in Japan for any decent time would take issue with the lazy platitudes of the armchair Japanophile. But one stereotype I've never found a critic of is that Japanese television is astronomically shite. I mean, where do I start? I'd sooner find the words to describe the genealogical timeline of the Peruvian newt. We assume in the West that the likes of Gogglebox and YouTube reaction videos are some new, unnervingly meta, Orwellian innovations in the way that we consume television. But this filtering of media through the eyes of insufferable cunts has been a staple of Japanese programming for decades. If the content is not directly filmed in front of a live panel of these cretins, then it constantly interrupts with cuts back to the studio, or is itself impregnated with copious talking head boxes, so we don't have to miss 1 second of their shiny, gawping, punchable faces. And if that wasn't distraction enough, the screen is further gang-raped by an invasion of titles, subtitles, and onomatopoeic ejaculations reminiscent of 1960s comic books. Twat! In my eyes, the programs themselves can be boiled down to 3 main categories. The first and largest is food. Now, it's no mystery that Japan is a nation obsessed with the gastronomical arts, and nowhere is this fanaticism more apparent than on the Idiot Box. Thousands upon thousands of hours of annual programming dedicated solely to presenters looking at videos of delicious food and exclaiming that it looks delicious. Occasionally they'll sample the food in the studio and confirm that it is indeed delicious. Gazing at someone else slowly masticating, lips smacking, eyes closed, moaning with delight is a strange self-flagellating voyeurism akin to watching pornography, and seems to have the same effects. Some find it irresistibly, even addictively fulfilling, and a huge market has emerged online for this exact content, while others find it uncomfortable and repulsive. I fall into the latter category. For a country so plentiful, I find the intensity of their culinary fixation slightly unsettling. It's as if they're a starved people, dragged through existence by the mere hope of eventual nourishment, when, in reality, they're probably at the centre of the earth in their access to high-quality food. If people invested half the time they spend watching porn into making themselves more desirable to the opposite sex, they'd be infinitely happier, and infinitely less likely to go all Columbine in the nearest town centre. And I can't help but feel the same with food. I kind of understand losing yourself watching Superman firing lasers out of his cock on Mars or whatever he does, because that's something we, as humans, will never experience. But why on earth would you watch someone else cook and enjoy a meal in real time, when you have access to the exact same ingredients, equipment and knowledge? I think it just unnerves me to see society's fulfillment lying increasingly in a virtual world, and our increasing hesitancy to engage with the physical. I can't help but feel that the modern anxiety epidemic and lack of stoicism in the youth is fueled by a harrowing disconnect between the comfortable, fluid, anonymous, gratifying online world and the harsh reality of reality, where no one thinks you're attractive or interesting, you can't have whatever you want whenever you want, you can't block or log out of turmoil, and Swedish supermodels don't want to show you their tits. The second and most ghoulish of these 3 shiteagories is the home video or caught-on-camera style shows. And what, Harry, is so devilish about that, you may be asking? Didn't we all grow up watching Dawn French or Harry Hill machine pun over grainy clips of toddlers kicking their dads in the bollocks, or dogs falling off trampolines? Yes, we did. And some mild testicular trauma and borderline animal cruelty enjoyed over some fish fingers and beans is good clean fun, I say. But the calibre of footage shat out on prime Japanese airtime deviates slightly from the hee ha what a silly man trying to ride a unicycle into the hee ha that high-speed 4-car pile-up in Paraguay probably killed several families. Collapsing buildings, explosions, floods, fires. It seems nothing is unsuitable gawk fodder for the numbskull rent-a-cunts. You think a country that can't go 5 minutes without being raped by its tectonic plates might have a tad more decorum, but in the Japanese mind, the fact that these things are happening in far-off lands renders them akin to fiction, and fair game for daytime viewing. The final string to this insufferable bow is a variety show. This is where the stereotype of Japanese TV really comes into its own. Watching is like being spiked with mescaline and kicked through a children's play centre. People are singing, people are dancing, an old man in a nappy is doing an obstacle course for some reason, all whilst a panel of amateur sex offenders eagerly gaze on and offer their 2 yen. One thing you'll quickly learn when dipping your toe into Japanese culture is there is absolutely nothing on this earth that can't be described as cool, cute, interesting, scary, or delicious. Japanese is a beautifully broad language which lends itself effortlessly to poetry and humour, but somewhere along the line, the commentariat decided that their arsenal need only be stocked with these weapons. People who underestimate culture as the driving force of history need to spend an evening flicking through the circus that is Japanese TV. Only then will they realise that trying to grapple with high geopolitics is completely futile without first conceding that people's dispositions are set way before the big knobs start talking. And no amount of diplomas and snazzy suits are a match for hundreds of years of cultural formation, embedded in the language, music, art, religion, fashion, architecture, music, food, and entertainment of a nation. Staring into the box, I was struck by the realisation that even if I lived for 100 years in this country, huge parts of its culture would still be lost on me. If certain things aren't ingrained from day one, they never will be. I always heard non-native Britons or those from overseas talking of British humour, as if it was some grandiose exclusive club, and took no notice. As to me, the things we made fun of and the way we made fun of them were as universal as breathing. It's only since I've lived as an outsider looking in on a country that too prides itself on an eccentric humour that I can empathise with those that gaze blankly at Alan Partridge or David Brent. Well, sort of. It's interesting how good music manages to transcend its origin, but even the greatest comedy still often exists within strict cultural parameters. I've never heard of anyone poo-poo the Rolling Stones or Stevie Wonder for being too English or too American, but I've heard even the most accomplished and beloved comedians be tarred with this brush. Of course, there is no lack of visceral tribalism when it comes to music, but it tends to be organised by genre rather than geographical location. I wouldn't bat much of an eyelid at the Scot who preferred Tupac to the Proclaimers, as being partial to hip-hop over whatever the fuck the Proclaimers are seems fair enough. But I'd be extremely taken aback to learn that the same Scot preferred Seinfeld to Billy Connolly, even if he was more partial to a sitcom than a stand-up. We seem to be able to exercise a certain amount of cultural empathy and revel in cultural dress-up when listening to music, even when it's a genre that's strongly tied to a particular race, class, or nationality other than our own. But when it comes to our sense of humour, we must play the cards we've been dealt by our surroundings. And plonked in front of this Tokyo TV, I didn't have a fucking Scooby. It made Nevermind the Buzzcocks look like Newsnight. Eventually, the assault on my senses became too much to bear. The combination of psilocybin chicken and Manson family television began to take on similar effects to ketamine. Plus, it would be an early start the next day, and only God, and anyone who had done any basic research, knew what kind of physical trial we were in for. The house was a steal for the price we paid, and boasted a number of spacious bedrooms with enough large double beds for us to enjoy one each. The taxing climb was bound to descend into homoeroticism, so there was no need for us to jump the gun. Before bed, I packed my rucksack for the next 2 days. I'm a firm advocate of travelling light, and had previously caused alarm by climbing mountains in nothing but a revealing pair of tattered rugby shorts and a well-trodden pair of flip-flops. But even I wasn't stupid enough to underestimate Mr. Fuji's treachery. I was absolutely not going to be one of those clueless foreigners who had to get airlifted to safety after 45 minutes because he ran out of Mars bars. No, no, no. For all my ability to withstand cold and hunger and fatigue, I would not be taking any risks by being unprepared. Now, Fuji is a very approachable climb, tackled by tens of thousands of amateurs every year, so I'm not saying I needed a pack mule, but I knew that food would be scarce and extortionately priced at the hill stations, and that the temperature would drop to dangerous levels once the sun clocked off for the day. My sack then would mainly be occupied by warm clothes, food, fluids, and most important of all, a tin of lager for the summit. There is something liberating about minimalism, and my Spartan adventures in the Japanese bush remain some of my most fulfilling experiences. But there is also something empowering about being economically but thoroughly packed with good kit. Rain, cold, heat, famine, drought, let them come, for I was packed to withstand it all. The route from Tokyo to Fuji is something of a journey in itself and involves a tedious combination of underground trains, overground trains and buses to reach Fuji's 5th station, where most people begin their ascent and end their descent. It was a good atmosphere, a vast stone square lined with huge log buildings, not dissimilar from a ski resort, and occupied by hundreds of adventurers, half of whom are collapsed in heaps of proud exhaustion and the other half teeming with nervous excitement. We scoffed one last hot meal at the canteen, supplied ourselves with hiking staffs, and trepidatiously made for the trail which would be our North Star for the foreseeable future. It was early afternoon. The weather had been pleasant all day, but sod's law, the moment we strung together more than 10 paces towards the summit, we began to feel the irritating, sporadic pitter-patter of drizzle on our heads. Thankfully, it remained sporadic enough not to dampen our spirits or clothes. The first few hundred yards of any hike are always the hardest, and if not surrounded by hardy folk, can have you questioning your motivation. As the incline kicks in, your heart starts ticking double time, your breathing becomes heavy and arrhythmic, the muscles in your legs begin to tense up, sweat drips from your brow, and in concert, every cell in your body begins to harass your brain with negative signals. Stop this right now. We paused after our first stretch of climb, nervously giggling to disguise our lungs' desperate plead for more air, trying not to guzzle water too frantically, regarding each other with mildly alarmed eyes. Through experience, I've realised that, at least in my case, this mild physical panic is just my body adjusting to its new existence. I never feel it when playing sports because they're normally preceded by long, meticulous warm-ups and adrenaline-rousing speeches. Plus, most team sports depend on short bursts of energy followed by periods of relative rest, rather than the constant metronomic plod of a hike. I knew once we'd seen off this initial wobble and found some rhythm, we'd be able to cover some serious ground. Say what you will about toxic masculinity, but the stigma associated with being the first one to complain, quit or show weakness has driven me through many a challenge. The phrase man up has become a whipping boy in the mental health conversation, but the mountain doesn't care. If you want to conquer it, you must be stoic. The detail people often miss when thinking about Fuji, myself included, is that Mount Fuji is not actually a mountain, it's a volcano. Part of the enjoyment of climbing a mountain is basking in the plentiful surrounding nature. Pick a wild flower, take a drink from a cool brook, rest under the shade of an old oak, perhaps spy some deer, delightful. But not on Fuji. Fuji is barren. Fuji is monotonous. Fuji is the fucking moon. As we traipsed, I finally understood that song by the Police. Dead end job. The old saying goes, it is not the destination that matters, but the journey. Ordinarily, I'd agree, but in the case of Mr. Fuji, it was all about the eventual payoff. In the meantime, we were essentially commuting. The terrain shifting from steps to path to scrambly rock is about as exciting as it gets between the hill stations. These are situated every few hundred feet and provide climbers with bunkhouses, toilets, snack kiosks and the coveted Yaki Inn. A unique brand that can be burned into a climber's wooden hiking staff, the idea being that once the climber is finished, their previously plain pole will be transformed into a tapestry of vertical progress. I usually just opted for a handful of Haribo and a sit down. If I could find a seat, that is, because the other tedious thing about climbing Fuji is the other people. It serves us right for going on a public holiday weekend and for climbing Fuji in the first place. For, due to its significance in Japan's national character, Fuji is a magnet for bucket listers who have never climbed a mountain before and who never will again. I too was a bucket lister and am certainly no Sherpa, but something I do pride myself on is my ability to string together more than 10 steps without stopping suddenly in the middle of a narrow pathway to huff oxygen and suckle from a 50,000 yen camelback that I'll never use again. Japan is the mecca of all the gear no idea. To look at my fellow climbers, I'd think they were seasoned pros, clad head to toe in Arc'teryx, Columbia and North Face, carabiners clinking like an Everest expedition, when in reality, what Fuji is a 6-hour mildly taxing hike that can be done in some sturdy trainers and gym clothes. When it's busy, certain parts of the trail become something of a queue, and nothing punctures one's spirit more than being stuck behind a human centipede of dawdling Inaka housewives as the light wanes and the air starts to nip. I finally understand that song by the Police, Don't Stand So Close to Me, and its lesser-known B-side, Get the Fuck Off My Mountain, You Slow Cunts. Manning one of the hill stations, we met a man from Kumamoto who seemed not fazed in the slightest to be faced with a gaggle of gaijin halfway up Fuji who hail from his obscure hometown. Along my travels in Japan, when I tell people I live in Kumamoto, it's usually met with astoundment and amusement, which, to be fair, was my exact reaction when learning that my Japanese tutor lived in Tring, a small Hertfordshire village about 20 minutes drive from where I grew up. To put it in perspective, its claim to fame is a museum that houses an exhibition of preserved animal shit. At least Kumamoto has a castle. If I ever meet anyone from Kumamoto whilst elsewhere in Japan, I usually react like I've stumbled across Dr. Livingstone. Perhaps the thin mountain air had got to this chap's noggin, for he didn't share my enthusiasm. Despite my poo-pooing of the over-preparedness of our fellow climbers, as you ascend Fuji, the air does begin to satiate you less and less. Anyone who has been skiing will understand the feeling. The dry lips, the fuzzy-headedness, the unsatisfactory breathing. It's uncomfortable when you haven't properly acclimatized, but not enough to really hinder a pack of robust bucks like us, and certainly not enough to be huffing on bottles of oxygen like a Scouser huffs on spray paint. With every step the air grew thinner, but with every step we moved closer to our lodgings, and beyond that, the summit. As previously mentioned, there's not a hell of a lot of eye candy on the mountain itself, but the view of the world you have left behind is something to behold. Fuji is surrounded by 5 Great Lakes and is just one part of a gorgeous national park. Beyond that lies the distinctive panorama of Tokyo. The higher we climbed, the more was revealed to us, but before long the vast lakes became mere puddles, the dense cities and towns became vague blotches, then suddenly it was all gone. We had pierced through the clouds. Suddenly having the rest of civilization cut off willed me on. There was now nothing to go back to, and no gauge of how far we'd come, only of how far we had left to go. The sun had begun to set. It became increasingly difficult to plant my feet with any confidence, and there was a sharp nip in the air. The simple thought of soon being horizontal grew in its profundity, and as we arrived at the hill station that would house us for the next few hours, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't relieved. We entered, imprisoned our sweaty boots into plastic bags, as even on the mountain Japanese homely etiquette was to be observed, and were shown to our sleeping quarters. The place was quite remarkable. From the outside and from within the entrance lobby, it seemed as though it would struggle to accommodate more than a dozen people, but behind the formalities of the lobby lay a deep network of poky corridors, rising with the incline of the mountain. Branching off both sides were long rooms of bunks. Everything was wooden and ruggedly put together by hand. The bunks were not so different to those in a capsule hotel, only looked like they were built in the 1850s. Each futon was entombed in a crate about 3 meters long, 2 meters wide, and 1 meter tall, with a privacy curtain at the tail end. Like the famed sleeping capsules of Tokyo, they are a nice balance of terrifyingly claustrophobic and endearingly cozy. Regardless, I was dog-tired, and anywhere I could lie flat without freezing to death would feel like the Marriott. Something that surprises me about the Japanese, and that made me feel warmly at home as an Englishman, is their love of curry. Introduced to the country by English sailors, it was swiftly re-bastardized and adopted into the national cuisine as a comfort food favourite. In Japan, wherever you find toilsome adventure, you will find solace in curry. Ski slopes, service stations, airports, and, lucky for us, in the hill stations of Mount Fuji. After a taxing afternoon's yomp, slouching round a table with the boys, absorbing the warmth of the kerosene heater, scoffing down some curry and rice, was blissful sanctuary. A frosty beer or whiskey highball would have been the icing on the cake. Alas, the place was as dry as Gandhi's flip-flops, and I refused to break into my celebratory provisions until the summit. The moment my brain registers that it must sleep or else, it immediately galvanizes my consciousness into hyper-wakefulness mode. It's always been the same. Christmas Eve, the night before an early rugby match, the few hours before a chaotic international night flight, I have zero trouble nodding off at my desk or watching a supposedly gripping film. But any time I tell myself that sleep is a must right now, my hypothalamus opts for self-sabotage. The goal was to reach the summit of Fuji in time to see the sunrise. This, and prospective future boasting, was our only motivation for the hours of dragging our bones up that majestic rock. Missing out was not an option, and, aware of the hundreds of other climbers who shared our exact goal, we opted to restart our ascent at 3 a.m, the ghastliest of all hours. Nothing good ever happened at 3 a.m. 2 a.m. you might find yourself getting lucky in a kebab shop. 4 a.m. you might be beginning a productive day's fishing or hunting. But 3 a.m. is a useless purgatory between night and day that is only worth being unconscious for. Alas, the necessity of the task trumped whatever clock-based biases I held, so the alarms would sound at 2:30. My rustic tomb was comfortable enough, and my body had earned its fatigue, yet I tossed and turned, hyper-aware of every rustle and splutter of my temporary roommates, bitterly jealous of their obliviousness to the world outside of their dreaming minds. In times like these, I usually turn to Chopin or some dull philosopher to bail me out, but even they couldn't help me. The next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake by one of the boys. What cruel joke is this, I thought, to wake such a shagged man so soon after his nodding off. But, squinting at my phone, I could see I'd had my fill, and it was time to move. It was dark, cold, and we all looked like shit. I was glad I wasn't the only one who barely got a wink, but there was no time to wallow in our grumpiness. The path to the summit was already becoming congested, and we had a fair way to go. The sunrise would wait for no man, and that lit a fire under our arses and drove us forward through the frosty mist. A general sense of urgency was in the air as hundreds of climbers plodded towards the top. The darkness was fading, and we all knew the sun wouldn't be far off. But as we approached the final few hundred yards to the summit, we hit gridlock. A static queue stood between us and our goal. I've heard that nowadays this is the case even at the Everest summit during peak season. Scores of people literally freeze and asphyxiate to death whilst politely waiting to stand at the highest point on Earth. I don't quite know what this says about my character, but I get it. I think I'd rather die than go through months of preparation, travel and grueling climbing, spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on gear and logistics, only to turn back a stone's throw away from the summit. The constant if only that would plague my mind would probably drive me to top myself anyway. Imagine being the guy at the party who almost climbed Everest. I'd rather be known as the town gimp. Thankfully, there would be no one dropping dead on Fuji that morning. The queue moved at a snail's pace, but it moved nonetheless. It was mildly tedious, but before too long we were through the torii and standing on the summit with time to spare. It was packed with people eagerly awaiting the sunrise. Partially for the sheer spectacle of the otherworldly beauty that was about to bless us, and partially because it was fucking freezing once you stopped moving, and a UV injection would be more than welcome. I hadn't touched my stash of warm clothes the entire climb, and had thought it a waste of space, but that time on top had me desperately scrambling for anything dense and fluffy to deter the sharp air from penetrating my bones. Amongst the clothes was my big Union Jack, utterly useless at fighting off the cold physically, but the imperial pride of old warmed my cockles immensely. Plus, if I was ever going to be an obnoxious patriot, now was the time. I draped it round myself like a great cloak and felt like Captain John Smith. I was not alone. Plenty of foreign climbers emerged at the top sporting their own colours. I was even beckoned over to some souvenir photos with them. Japan is one of the few places on Earth where the Union Jack is not met with suspicion or hostility, but with admiration. Thankfully, the perpetual catastrophic American foreign policy that has dominated modern geopolitics has increasingly pushed Britain's past foreign ventures out of the spotlight. I mean, at least we left behind some good schools and railways. All the Yanks left behind was a trail of Big Macs and Agent Orange. We found a spot at the very edge of the earth, plonked ourselves down on the jagged ground, and graciously awaited the dawn. The base of the sky was beautifully carpeted with a thick cloud, uninterrupted from our feet to the glowing horizon. I felt like I was surveying the endless frozen plains of the Arctic. Despite the Republic of Kiribati, which lies just west of the international dateline, being the factual land of the rising sun, I was overcome with the sense that I was witnessing the birth of the universe. As the sun gingerly poked its head above the parapet, the skyline was suddenly stained a deep orange, and a pleasant warmth washed over me. The bold tricolour of the pearly white cloud, the fiery glow of the horizon, and the crystal blue sky was something biblical. I marked the occasion like any decent Englishman by cracking open a warm, hike-shaken tin of beer. It may not have been the freshest or the highest quality, but the gravitas of the occasion made it as crisp and refreshing as any pretentious small batch craft nonsense. I take very little interest in photography, but thankfully my compadres do, and managed to snap some stunning mementos of the occasion. To share a collective sense of awe with so many people was an incredibly moving experience. Those around us had come from across Japan and the world, but had all endured the same trial, and now we were reaping the rewards as one. It struck me that the sunrise we witnessed was painfully ordinary, yet profoundly unique. It has happened like clockwork since long before man ever set foot on earth, and it will continue long after the last man returns to the dust. But of all the millions of sun-ups gazed at by the millions of people thrust into existence, only a tiny handful saw this one, as we did. The atmosphere at the top was one of joy, and as we wandered around the rocky and craterous summit, there was a palpable feeling of solidarity in the air. The same feeling that follows an epic sports match or concert. Wow, we were there. What goes up must come down, and we couldn't linger on top all day. I knew that the path down would not be the same as the path up, but beyond that I hadn't really considered what was in store. An absolute fucking nightmare. The way down was a series of 50-yard, 45-degree slopes artificially cut into the mountain like a helter-skelter. As I write this, even I am thinking, that doesn't sound so bad, but I'm yet to explain the makeup of the terrain underfoot. The ground was made up of the loosest, coarsest, shoe-swallowing, ankle-slicing loam you've ever had the misfortune to tread on. Every step is a roll of the dice that is likely to put you on your arse, and if it doesn't, it will fill up your footwear with gravel, claw at any piece of exposed skin below the knee, and thrust you stumbling into the next step, which will most likely put you on your arse. Round and round you go, endlessly shambling through this dusty purgatory, no real feeling of progress ever being achieved. After over an hour of this, we began to realise that our slow and steady approach was unsustainable. We were losing the will to live. It would be better to endure maximum discomfort in a mad dash to the bottom than to continue slowly torturing ourselves for the next few hours. Forsaking any oaths of togetherness, we began to trundle down at whatever pace we could individually bear. I threw any concern for stability out the window and threw myself down the decline. I didn't give a fuck if I was running, tripping, sliding, tumbling, as long as I was getting closer to the ground. By the time I hit it, my feet felt like they were carbonated. I arrived at the cobbled square of the 5th station approximately 15 hours after we had left, before most of the other lads. I slammed my rucksack onto the ground as a squishy prop for my head and lay flat in the morning sun. If compiling a list of suitable materials for a mattress, cobblestones would probably be dead last. But sweaty, aching and finally finished, it felt like a cradle of swandown. Rest is wasted on most people most of the time. In our age of instantaneous automated convenience, we are so far removed from the labour that props up our society that true hard graft is rarely experienced nor seen, thus rest is seldom earned. The types of jobs and chores that burn the fat off a person's soul have all but disappeared from our societies. You tap on an app and before you've had your next shit you can have worldly treasures only known before to kings physically put in your hands without having to cross your threshold. And we still manage to moan about it. It's been 25 minutes, where's my fucking avocado salad? Yesterday those avocados were swinging from a tree in fucking Guatemala. Then, by some absolute miracle of consumer capitalism, which no one seems to be able to explain to me, it's ended up in a cafe in Daventry overnight, been hand-prepared for you personally by a professional chef, then driven by someone to wherever you happen to be sat within a 10-mile radius, and hand-delivered to you, in exchange for the amount of money you probably earn during the time it takes for you to scoff it down. It wasn't that long ago that you needed 18 months at a fucking Armada just to get your hands on some turmeric. How many of us can honestly say we work hard? And I don't mean, oh, my line manager has told me she needs the marketing figures by 4. I'm talking, we lost 3 good lads hoisting that rigging today. I don't pine for the days where every morning a man left for work he may never come back, but it's worth regularly putting yourself in some mild peril in order to appreciate how, when compared to 99.9% of all living things that have ever existed, miraculously comfortable our lives are. Unearned comfort bugs our brain out and leads to nihilism and depression, or a postmodern desire to tear down everything that ever contributed to our success. Tough times felt firsthand or vicariously through those that have come before us puts our comfort into context and forces us to appreciate every second we're not tired, hungry, weak, or lying on cobblestones with shoes full of gravel. Whether prince or pauper, to exist is to suffer, and gratitude is the only antidote to becoming completely overwhelmed by resentment at our being here. The fact of the matter is, whether you're black, white, male, female, gay, straight, Christian, Muslim, and every intersection they offer, if you exist in 21st century Europe, North America, or Japan, you have won the lottery. And spending just a few hours cold, hungry, or exhausted prevents that thought from drifting too far from your conscious. If I spend even a short time wallowing in decadence, I all too readily feel myself become an entitled, sluggish, and whingy twat. The eventual rest following a period of immense physical or mental stress is when I'm most cosmically content. I can't help but feel that we would live in a utopia if every major policy decision was preceded by a quick yomp up Helvellyn in the rain. Prime Minister, shall we proceed with carpet bombing that Yemeni playground? Perhaps not. Can we make sure everyone's got shoes? Yeah, comfortable ones, yeah. It's a shame that doing all the things that mellow out the human urge for destruction, weed, yoga, hiking, all have the byproduct of becoming utterly insufferable company. Mental peace is a fine balance and seldom chemically induced in the long term. It takes hard work and dedication. That's why so few people achieve it. You won't resent the toil when you know rest is on the horizon, and you won't resent the rest when the hard work is completed. This is why the Sabbath makes sense. Not necessarily in the devout sense of turning off all the lights and banning Tesco Express from opening, but putting a day aside regularly to fuck the phone off, fuck the emails off, and engage with real people who inhabit the real world. Take a walk, catch a fish, tell your kids a story, remind yourself that the world is more than immigrant fascist pedos with coronavirus. The phrase, "this can wait," has been all but lost from our vernacular. People think that because they have the ability to reach you 24/7, that equates to some kind of round-the-clock duty that you owe to every bozo with Wi-Fi. Take it as read that outside of the hours where work starts and work finishes, I'm dead to you. Obviously, if you're a doctor or a policeman and someone's heart explodes within 100 yards of your sun lounger, there should be a certain amount of societal pressure for you to put down the daiquiri and exercise your expertise. But don't you dare try and tell me that there's accounting or grouting that can't wait until Monday morning. There should be a vitriolic stigma associated with sending work emails on weekends, bank holidays, or any major Christian festival. I had fallen into a deep doze before being roused awake by the returning stragglers, the kind of sleep so overdue that you physically feel your consciousness leave your body and die. Left alone, I'd have probably woken up the following Tuesday. Alas, the day was young. Waking up early really is a revelation. I'd summited the tallest mountain in Japan, had a religious experience, scurried back down, dozed, and it wasn't even midday yet. Just like to reach the summit, there would be an arduous queue to get off the mountain by bus. I've mostly dismissed the idea of karma, but I've noticed that when I do good things, the universe has a habit of rewarding me. This time, divine intervention came in the form of the hectic but delightfully kind old lady that was conducting the buses to and from the stop. Being a foreigner in Japan has a number of uncomfortable and frustrating downsides that will knock you back on a daily basis, and which drive many an expat to resent the country they reside in. But I would be lying if I said it didn't come with an awful lot of perks. Some may call it fetishization or Orientalism, but people's fascination and intrigue with those different from them can play into your hands. Also, the deliberate ignorant foregoing of local etiquette under the guise of being a clueless foreigner is something of a get-out-of-jail-free card. We refer to it as the Gaijin Smash. The queue was growing longer and longer and moving tortuously slowly. Just as we thought we would be bus-bound, we were informed that it had hit capacity with the group in front of us. Our patience was wearing thin, so, catching Mrs. Bus Traffic Controller's attention, we politely inquired into the ETA of the next bus. Charmed by the impressive Japanese ability of such a ragtag motley crew, and desperate to demonstrate Japan's unique brand of hospitality or omotenashi, she pulled her radio to her face like John Rambo and started hustling every channel on the airwaves. Before long, she had commandeered us a handsome vessel for passage down the mountain. Now allow me to give an example of the detrimental effects of not possessing the Japanese phenotypes. Our bones were aching and our skin was thickly coated with a mirepoix of dust and sweat. So what better place for us than the sanctuary of the onsen? Nothing quite hits the spot after a rough day's work than the warm, steamy embrace of a hot spring bath. Punters must thoroughly shower off before enjoying the baths, so our dishevelled appearance was trivial. It's commonplace for locals to head to the onsen after hikes, sports matches, or a long shift on site. Despite this, the receptionist gazed upon us for a moment in disgust, then reluctantly informed us that the onsen was very busy. On the brink of collapsing from exhaustion, we called his bluff. Naturally, what greeted us when we stripped off and staggered through the steam was one man and his son. Busy my left bollock. But the joke was ultimately on the xenophobic receptionist, for as he swept up my pubes, I stared at the heavens while the mineral-dense nectar of the mountain slowly brought me back to life. Somehow, the emotional and physical ups and downs of Fuji had not fully quenched our lust for the extreme, so our final stop before heading back to the bright lights of the city was Fuji-Q theme park. My body was crashing hard, but my mind was raring to get amongst that unique atmosphere that only theme parks provide. The anxious energy of patient thrill seekers, the clanking and screaming of mechanical death traps, the smell of overpriced, artery-eroding foodstuff. It's an environment that always inspired joy in me. Plus, ever since being rightfully bullied onto one as a nervous child, I've adored roller coasters, and Fuji-Q boasted some of the finest pant shitters in Japan and the world. Upon its opening in 1996, Fujiyama was the tallest roller coaster in the world, standing at 79 meters. Its design is now probably seen as vanilla amongst hardcore coaster heads, up, down, corkscrews, loop-the-loops, etc. But its piece de resistance is its view from the top. As with many a coaster, you're clanked upwards for what seems like months, staring nervously into the sun. But as you're finally unshackled and allowed to cruise into the plateau, you're greeted by the most stunning image of Mount Fuji. A strange cocktail of emotions flooded my system. I was awestruck by what I was seeing and didn't want it to end, partly because I hadn't finished basking in its beauty, partly because my pelvis was about to fall out my arse as we edged closer to the drop. It's strange to simultaneously feel heavenly divine and mortally terrified. But before I could unpack this dualism, I was plummeting down the track with arms in the air like I just didn't care. I wouldn't recommend a state of fatigue when treating your brain box to a G-force party. I thoroughly enjoyed the thrill, as I always do, but as I got off, I felt like a stiff breeze would have floored me. A smart man would have made for the teacups or log flume, but we were idiots, so we staggered towards Air Janaka. I had done no research on the park, so my plan consisted of pointing at things and declaring, "That looks fucking mental, where's the entrance?" Air Janaka definitely looked fucking mental, but I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. We'd arrived at the park at the tail end of the day. It wasn't unbearably mobbed, but there were enough people so that queuing was a factor. The park would be closing soon, so we had to weigh up the risks of joining the queue and possibly seeing out the rest of the day for just one ride, or gambling on the lesser rides having shorter wait times. Quality or quantity. In the end, it was decided that Air Janaka looked sufficiently mental to warrant its queue. Though, as with all theme park attractions, the queue catfished us with expert proficiency. At a glance, they never looked that bad. We'll be on in 20 minutes, you kid yourself, before realising that inside the queue double backs on itself 18 times and goes up and down more stairs than a fucking lighthouse keeper. Still, we were together, the sun was shining, and we weren't up to our tits in gravel. People were having a worse day. The queue ticked along and we snaked through the various tunnels, staircases and corridors that eventually put us in sight of the beast itself. I knew we were in for some absolute carnage when I saw that the passengers were being loaded in lying on their backs, facing the wrong way, with their legs up like they were about to have a pap smear. I regarded it as a pig might regard a sausage maker, terrified yet oddly hungry. The faces of the brave souls returning from around on Air Janaka told a story of horror, with eyes that stare right through you, but which still convey the message, "Fly, you fools." Once again, toxic masculinity came to the rescue. We'd waited too long and come too far to even entertain the idea that what we were about to experience worried us in the slightest. So, once the gaggle of victims had been cleared out and their entrails brushed off the seats, we tucked our shoes away, put on our big boy faces, and entwined ourselves into our mechanical cradles. I pulled my restraint down until it compressed my chest to the point of discomfort. I could take a bit of thoracic pressure. What I couldn't take was being hurled off the ride at 80 miles per hour and turning a Japanese family dinner 16 miles away into a scene from the day after tomorrow. Once the checks were complete, the steward gave the all clear and we jerked into motion. Hollers of nerves and excitement ping-ponged around the carriage as we were suddenly thrust 45 degrees upwards as the carriage began its ascent. Being sat back to front, we were oblivious to what was ahead of us, which only added to the trepidation. All we could see and use to gauge where we were was the park below us, which gradually shrunk into insignificance. Once the clank of the chain began to slow, I knew chaos was imminent. We paused for a moment, then free fell into a backwards negative 121-degree drop. This sounds scary enough, but it wasn't until we'd reached the bottom and been thrust into the next stage of the ride that I learned of Ejanika's party trick. Not only are you being thrown backwards through corkscrews, loops and humps, but your seat itself is also being spun forwards and backwards 360 degrees independent of the carriage, in what I've since learned is referred to in the biz as a fourth dimension hypercoaster. We had transcended any notion of linear physics. Oh, here comes the down bit. Oh, here comes the loopy bit. No. This was a complete raping of the mind and body. I didn't know which way was up. My bollocks had traded places with my brain. Meanwhile, my internal organs were being churned into pate. Grown men, myself included, whimpered like scolded puppies and cried out with a fear more genuine than we'd ever experienced. I've looked it up and apparently the ride's duration is 2 minutes, which, as I'm constantly reminding my girlfriend, can feel like a lifetime when you're having your world turned upside down. We pulled back into the loading bay looking like we'd just been pulled off Guadalcanal, pale, panting and dishevelled, not knowing how we could possibly return to civil society after what we'd been through. I stepped off the ride like a blind baby giraffe walking through treacle. It was clear I would need a moment before my motor skills returned. The only coherent syllables I was able to utter were different variations of "fucking hell." We regarded each other in agreement that what we just experienced was quite something. The only thing dropping faster than the roller coasters was our energy levels. We weaved through the park, hoping to squeeze one last thrill in before closing time, but it was ultimately futile. We dragged ourselves to the bus stop and waited for our ride back to civilization. Fuji had chewed us up, spat us out, and given us the sole of its boot, but we were better men for it. It hadn't occurred to me that driving back into Tokyo during the close of a public holiday weekend might not be the slickest journey. We crept along the highway at a walking pace, and I'd never been so desperate to slip into something more comfortable, like a fucking coma, and sprawl myself out on the sofa in my undies covered in Korean chicken and beer froth. We decided to dine as we had on our first night, but as time ticked away, as did the viability of our prospective feast. I watched the clock like a man being shot at dawn, slipping in and out of consciousness. God knows how many excruciating hours later we arrived back in central Tokyo. We snapped into gear and began navigating the inner city transport like men possessed, attempting to get back to our Airbnb and, more importantly, the chicken shop. I'm not an actively religious man, but as we hopped on and off subway trains, I may have uttered a few appeals to the Almighty. To be rational about it, coming out on the right side of a 50-50 chance doesn't quite constitute a miracle, but upon our arrival, the fluorescent lights and lingering smell of bubbling grease cut through the darkness and signalled to us that we would not be going unfed. Praise be the Lord. We scurried home through the night, loaded down with sweating bags of spicy flesh and icy bags of cheap lager. Crossing the threshold was like being Benjamin Buttoned back into the snug comfort of the womb, but with the added bonus of Korean food. Finding ourselves back in the exact state in which we started was surreal, like it had all been a fever dream. It had been less than 48 hours since we departed, but in that time we had dragged ourselves to the highest point in the country and back down again, had our bodies healed by tectonic liquor and ravaged by mechanical masochism, and all in time for tea and the programme where Japanese men recite tongue twisters while being slapped in the balls.